Thank you. Yes. Thank you very much, Aliyar, for the introduction and for the invitation. So let me share my slides. All right, I think that's it. Can everybody see it? Yeah. All right. So I will be talking about slurs, affective sciences, and what I call group sentiment expressivism. I've changed the title from what I told Aliyar a few weeks back. And so I will only talk at the end about why this kind of expressivism doesn't exclude descriptivism and how it may apply to other terms. And I'm sorry if my first title was misleading. It's a work in progress, so I hope you understand that I've changed the focus. All right. So the plan of the talk is first to introduce these two family of theories, descriptivism and expressivism about slurs. I'll then present my own view that I call group sentiment expressivisms and how it is based in 3 insights from the affective sciences. Then I'll present some standard objections to affective expressivism and reply. And then I'll zoom out at the end of the talk to talk about expressivism, descriptivism, and the analysis of valence terms beyond slurs, very briefly. So by slur, I mean a derogatory or insulting term applied to a particular group of people, such as a racial slur. And in my talk, I will be used the slur Welsh, which is a slur used by German-speaking Swiss for French-speaking Swiss, like myself. So we French-speaking Swiss are called Roman, and yeah, they call us Welsh sometimes. It's not very offensive, but yes, it's still a slur, and I use it because I'm Roman and because it's not so offensive. So yeah. Okay, let's go on. Descriptivism and expressivism about slurs. So descriptivism about slurs is a theory in the philosophy of language about the meaning of slur that may be described as follows. What is negative about the meaning of slurs is to be analyzed in terms of the characteristics that slurs attribute to the targets of slurs, or that, yeah, the representations that they convey perhaps also. An example would be Welsh is something like Roman and contemptible or bad in some other way because of being Roman. That would be a descriptive theory about the meaning of Welsh. And it's been defended in various ways by various people, including William Lycan, if I'm not mistaken. And expressivism about slurs says that what is negative about the meaning of slurs is to be analyzed in terms of the psychological states that slurs express. And I will be focusing on affective expressivism, which states that should be analyzed in terms of affective states that are expressed. I'm just going to put, I forgot to put on timer. Opla. So for instance, Richard writes, a word is a slur when it is a conventional means to express strong negative attitudes toward members of a group. Oops, and it's been defended by several people in different ways. And I will be defending a version of this account. Let me very briefly motivate affective expressivism. So one thing is that the meaning of slur, or rather the meaning of slurs, or rather what is negative about the meaning of slurs seems to be ineffable, very hard to paraphrase. And this is the case also for many expressive terms or signals. So it's hard to paraphrase the meaning of emojis or of interjections or of affective tones of voices, for instance. Slurs can be used in sentences with an expressive syntax, as in, you Welsh, or he's such a Welsh. What is wrong with slurs seems to rather be that they are appropriate than literally false. And similarly, when I say ouch, and I'm not in pain, this seems to be inappropriate in some way, misleading, but it's not strictly speaking false. And if I'm disgusted by something that I shouldn't be disgusted by, this may be inappropriate, but it's not strictly speaking false. We expect slur users to have certain action tendencies that may be linked with the emotions that they would express with these terms. So, for instance, we would expect people who use homophobic slurs to avoid homophobic people or such action tendencies. And slurs have a feature that is called hyperprojectivity. That is that their negative meaning somehow projects out of embedded clauses like negation or conditionals. So Sam is not a Welsh, although it negates this property, still conveys a negative meaning toward homo. And this could be compared to the case where Sam is not a homo, said with a contemptuous tone or disgust emoji. Of course, there are other, hyperprojectivity may happen outside of expressive meaning. It's just a few, features that would motivate an affective expressivism for slurs. Now, very briefly, let me mention the 4 objections that I will be talking about in the third part of the talk as an introduction. First one is that it makes no sense to challenge someone's affective feelings, although it makes a lot of sense to challenge someone's use of a slur. The second one is that affective expressivism, or sometimes I'll just say expressivism for short, but I'll always be talking about affective expressivism, forces to accept a homo is a Welsh as true, because expressivism says that the difference in meaning between homo and Welsh allegedly is not a truth conditional difference. So that's why. Using a slur while denying negative effects seems to be possible without contradiction. So you may say things like, I have nothing but admiration for Welsh, without contradiction apparently, but it would be somehow contradictory to say something like, yuck, I'm not disgusted. And last objection, slurs can be offensive irrespectively of users' mental states. So if you use the N-word, whether or not you harbor negative feelings toward Black people, you will be offensive. So the offensiveness of slurs doesn't seem to depend on the psychological state of the speaker. All right. And my claim is that expressivism can answer these objections thanks to insights from affective sciences. Okay, let's go on to the second part, and I account group sentiment expressivism and how it is based on insight from affective sciences. So the short version of this account is the following. Slurs are cues, often signals, expressive of group sentiments. And by sentiments, I mean a tendency to undergo emotions about certain objects. Group sentiments are sentiments that are so prevalent in a group that it could define this group. So, for instance, homophobic people would be a group that is defined by a sentiment, potentially. That's a possibility, at least. A cue is an information carrier, and a signal is a cue that is designed to carry that information. So again, slurs would be cues expressive of group sentiments, often signals. So slurs may perhaps potentially always be signals for negative sentiments that it's a possibility because they are either because they are intentionally designed to carry this information. So someone may create a new slur and intentionally design it to express negative sentiments, for instance. And it's understood as a signal for negative sentiment, or because slurs have been culturally selected to play this function. They have been conventionalized to express negative sentiments. Those are possibilities, but I will not presuppose them, and so I will talk about cues instead of signals. Cues being just information carrier. All right. Yes, for reasons that are discussed by Nunberg, for instance, when he talks about the term Redskins and the Washington Redskins fans, and yeah, just mentioning that. The long version of my account is the following. A slur is a term or idiom that purports to refer to a target group. So Welsh purports to refer to Roman, is expressive of a negative sentiment toward this target group. I'll talk about homophobia in a bit. That could be a candidate for homophobic slurs. Is expressive in virtue of being widely recognized cue for the adherence to a group whose members have this negative sentiment. And actually, the widely recognized is not supposed to be, it should be qualified. It's usually widely recognized, sorry. Because there may be creative slurs. Someone may create a new slur. It's not widely recognized, but nevertheless, it can be, can work as a slur. So yes, it's expressive in virtue of being a cue for the adherence to a group whose members have these negative sentiments. So for instance, a homophobic slur could be expressive in virtue of being recognized as a cue for the adherence to a homophobic group. And the slur is inappropriate, offensive, and harmful insofar as the sentiment is inappropriate, offensive, and harmful. All right. The first insight from affective sciences that should help to defend my account is about sentiments and prejudices. And because prejudicial attitudes, such as homophobia or xenophobia, may be analyzed as sentiments. That has been proposed by several psychologists studying prejudices. For instance, homophobia may be analyzed as a tendency to undergo emotions such as, or has been analyzed as a tendency to undergo emotions such as anger, anxiety, contempt, disgust, fear, and hate towards gay people. So it doesn't mean that a homophobic person would tend to undergo all these emotions, but perhaps one of them is sufficient. Note that terms such as homophobia or xenophobia may refer to other phenomena than a sentiment. So for instance, it may refer to structural, non-psychological phenomena. So a homophobic law is not psychological phenomena per se, but it may be an instance of homophobia understood in a different way. Homophobia may also refer to psychological but non-affective phenomena such as homophobic stereotypes. All right. The second insight is that we should distinguish between actual expressions and expressive cues. So actual expressions of affects, for instance, of emotions, are, according to Mitch, who is sorry not to be here today, he told me, are cases where you are in a state, in an affective state, in this case, in an emotional state, say, you both show and signal this state. But for no need to, that whatever is the bearer of expressive cues be in the affective state that is expressed in some other sense of expressed than the actual expression sense of expression. So for instance, and slurs would be expressive cues for sentiments and not actual expressions of emotions. So for instance, this dog may always have this face, and even when it's not sad, though it would have these features that are expressive of sadness. This is another example where you have this list of acoustic cues that are expressive of various emotions that can be used in vocal expression or musical performance here. And a robot, an artificial intelligence, may compose a piece of music with these features, cues expressive of anger without anybody undergoing the emotion of anger. Right. So I say that slurs are expressive cues for sentiments, and here are some other candidates for this category. Fans articles, such as the t-shirt of a band music tour or a sports team scarf, may be cues for a sentiment, for a disposition to undergo positive emotions toward the band or toward the team. Signs of respect or courtesies, so perhaps wearing a tie in certain contexts may be a sign of respect, and respect may be analyzed as a disposition to undergo certain emotion as a sentiment. Hate symbols such as the KKK symbols or the Nazi symbols can be analyzed also as expressive cues for sentiments, since hate is often analyzed as a sentiment, a disposition to undergo various emotions. And thoughtful, considerate, loving acts also can be expressive cues for sentiments. Some of these are signals, some of those are not signals. Doesn't matter, I'm just talking about cues here, which may or may not be signals. All right. The third insight is that, and perhaps probably the most important insight here, is that emotions are made of 5 components. And although emotions don't, there is no, there is no definition in affective sciences on which everybody agree for emotions, but nevertheless, there is a wide consensus that emotions involve these 5 components. And they are first, the appraisals of a situation. So if you are in the street late at night and you start being afraid, it would be normally because you somehow appraise the situation, apprehend the situation as inconducive to your safety, and you appraise yourself as not having the possibility to respond, say, adequately to the potential threats. And this triggers your fear. The second component would be the action tendencies associated with emotions, to avoid, to approach, to aggress. There are physiological changes, hormonal release, pupil dilatation, heart rate changes that are linked with the action tendencies. So if you're afraid, your heart rate will increase, supposedly in order to help you prepare for escape or fight. Motor expressions such as facial, vocal, or gestural expressions also are a component. And lastly, feelings of emotions such as unpleasant, intense, or feelings of powerlessness. So emotions are not mere feelings. Emotions are complex psychological episodes made of various components. And let me say more about these appraisals. So appraisals were postulated by philosophers and psychologists because of a quite straightforward phenomenon, which is that we don't have a one-to-one link between kinds of stimuli and kinds of emotional reactions. So we may respond with different emotions to the same kind of stimuli, and we may respond with the same kind of emotion to different kinds of stimuli. And that shows that emotions are not like reflexes. They are more flexible than that. And to explain this phenomenon, intermediary representations of a very low level have been postulated, and these are appraisals. So to explain that somebody undergoes fear toward the mouse in the kitchen, and another person anger, you say that the first person appraises the mouse as a threat, while the second appraises it as norm violating subject that needs to be aggressed or chased or something of that sort. Two people may undergo, or the same person may undergo aesthetic admiration toward very different kinds of stimuli, and this would be explained because the person can appraise these different kinds of stimuli as, say, beautiful. Okay. This is related to emotion theories in philosophy, and just to say that the mainstream, I would say, in philosophy of emotion are cognitive theories of various sorts. I myself defend a ability-desire kind of theory. There are non-cognitive theories that may refuse what I've said about appraisals, but they are minority view, and I'm not going to presuppose them here. I'm going to discard them here. Yes. The same could be said about psychology. Although there's a big consensus about the existence of appraisals, some theorists refuse it, of course. So once again, the standard view in affective sciences about paradigmatic emotional episodes is the following. There is a stimulus that is perceived or imagined or inferred or remembered. It is appraised in a certain way. These cause changes in action tendencies and physiological and motor reactions. And together, these three elements together modify emotional feelings, cause various emotional feelings, at least partially. And the steps 1, 2, 4, so everything before the emotional feeling must be very fast, automatic, and unconscious, because it happens between the perception of the stimulus, for instance, in a case where you have an emotion in response to seeing the mouse in the kitchen, and the feeling of fear or anger that you have in response to this perception. All right. So going back to my account, I say that a slur is a term or idiom that is expressive of a negative sentiment toward the target group, such as homophobia. And let me say more about this by giving an example that is based in research in affective sciences. So homophobia has been analyzed, as I said before, as a sentiment that's made of a tendency to undergo various emotions, such as anger, anxiety, contempt, disgust, fear, hate. And in turn, these emotions may be analyzed as involving certain appraisals and certain action tendencies that are associated with them, and that constitute them in some way. So for anger, you have norm violation and tendency to aggress. For anxiety, you have problematic uncertainty as an appraisal and a tendency to be cautious, etc. So to sum up the picture that I offer, you have a speaker that utters a slur. This purpose to refer to a target group and is a cue for the adherence to a group of slur users who tend to undergo negative emotions, which are about the target group and which involve as a component appraisals that are representations of the target group. Very low-level kinds of representations, very different from explicit evaluative judgments that are expressed through descriptive sentences, indicative sentences, but representations nonetheless, according to most definitions of representations that I know. Yes, all right. So that's a picture. Now let's go on with the objections. So the first objection was that it makes no sense to challenge someone's affective feelings. If you don't like the banana ice cream, you think it's unpleasant, you feel it as unpleasant, I'm not going to challenge this, right? And the same could be said for many other kinds of positive and negative feelings, affective feelings. And the reply that I would offer is that this may well be true, but it makes sense to challenge the appraisals and the action tendencies of a sentiment. And emotions and those sentiments are not only constituted by affective feelings, but also by appraisals and action tendencies. So we ought to challenge if homophobia really is constituted by such emotions, we ought to challenge its appraisals and its typical action tendencies, the typical action tendencies and typical appraisals that would be linked with these emotions, right? The second objection is that affective forces to accept a roman is a Welsh as true. And my reply would be that to say that this sentence is true is uncomfortably close to endorsing its use, as Whiting has noted, defended. And we don't want to endorse the appraisals and action tendencies that are expressed by slurs, if my account is correct, right? So compare with, for instance, a roman is a roman pronounced with overtly contemptuous voice. If somebody's asked, is this true? They may refuse to say yes. Similar, the president of European Parliament is Italian. Is this true or not? Most people perhaps would refuse to answer yes. The third objection is that using a slur while denying negative affect is possible, is a phenomenon that is probably rather common. So you may say things like, I don't despise Welsh, or I have nothing but admiration for Welsh. And this seems to be in contradiction with the idea that the meaning of slurs is to be analyzed as the expression of affect, right? The reply would be that it would be in several steps. First, there would be several replies rather. The first is, that affects may be inaccessible. So like this guy may say, no, I'm not upset, although he is. Because, for instance, we have an inability to identify emotion. It's a phenomenon that's quite widespread, in fact, because there are implicit biases and implicit attitudes, implicit emotions, implicit sentiments. And there may even be non-conscious sentiments, that is, sentiments that we cannot access at all consciously. Well, this may be the same as implicit affects, depending on how you understand these things. So, in general, affects may be inaccessible to the speaker that nevertheless has it. Second, affects may be or are extremely hard to paraphrase and may be somehow ineffable. And so somebody may say something like, I don't despise Welsh, in order to, because the person might say, I don't despise Welsh, they are just something like that, right? A person may deny having a certain emotion because the term used doesn't reflect what she feels or what she tends to feel. And lastly, I think, according to group sentiment expressivism, the speaker need not undergo or need not have a tendency to undergo the various emotions I was talking about before. Because the account says that slurs are cues for the adherence to a group, but the person may not belong to the group because, yeah. So for instance, a person may grow up surrounded by people who use a slur and who have negative sentiments toward the target group, and herself not have these sentiments, but nevertheless use the slur. The slur is still expressive of the sentiments, even though in this case, the person doesn't actually express the sentiments. That was the distinction between expressive cues and actual expression. The fourth and last objection was that slurs can be offensive irrespectively of users' mental states, and their offensiveness may vary with the societal context. So that's how Hom puts it. A speaker may be extremely prejudiced toward the English and not at all prejudiced toward African Americans, and yet the psychological state will almost have no effect on the pejorative force of the speaker's uses of limey and the N-word. And the N-word will be much more offensive irrespectively of the psychological state of the speaker. My reply would also be several replies. The first is once again that there may be cases of expressive cues without actual expression, like the person who grows up in an environment where slurs are commonly used, and so this person uses this slur although she doesn't harbor any negative sentiments toward the target group. And let's compare it with a case where there is a certain gesture that is recognizably expressive of, say, anti-Semitic sentiments. It doesn't matter whether a person who, it doesn't matter what is the psychological state of a person who uses it, it will be offensive nonetheless, right? So a cue that is expressive of certain sentiments may be offensive, even in cases where the person doesn't undergo or doesn't have the negative sentiment. The second reply is that I said that our group sentiment expressivism says that slurs are expressive in virtue of their association with a group of speakers. And so their offensiveness may vary with societal context, with how offensive are the sentiments of the group of speakers. So in contemporary America, there is no problem of xenophobia toward English people, you can say, but there is a huge racism problem toward African Americans. We can partially understand this matter of fact, I say partially, as through the lens of affective sciences and through the lens of sentiments, negative sentiments toward African Americans. And when a cue is expressive of these sentiments, it is extremely offensive. But when a cue is expressive of negative sentiments toward English, it is much less offensive because of this difference in society, because of the difference in the groups of speakers that use slurs, the sentiment group that I was talking about, the group of speakers, the group of people, sorry, that are defined through the sentiments that I was talking about, the negative sentiment. All right. Let me now zoom out and talk a little bit about expressivism, descriptivism, and the analysis of valent terms in slurs. So this is how I define affective expressivism and descriptivism about slurs at the beginning of the talk. What is affective expressivism says that what is negative about the meaning of slurs is to be analyzed in terms of the affective state that slurs express. while descriptivism would say that what is negative about the meaning of slurs is to be analyzed in terms of the descriptive characteristics or the characteristics that slurs attribute to the targets of slurs. And if my account is correct, then in some sense, we may say that slurs attribute negative characteristics to their targets, namely the characteristics that are represented by the relevant appraisals. So in some sense, if that is correct, then the expressivism that I've put forward is not in contradiction with descriptivism. It doesn't exclude descriptivism, though the link is tenuous, because the way in which the affective expressivism that I've talked about is a form of descriptivism is very indirect. And let me illustrate that once again with the scheme. According to this account, the slur user, well, the slur is a cue for the adherence of a group. So the speaker may not belong to the group. That's one thing that is indirect, right? The second indirect thing is that the group of speakers tend to undergo negative emotions. There is no one-one link between the two. So one person of this group may tend to undergo fear, another anger, another all of these emotions, etc. So, and finally, well, the negative emotions involved as a component in normal cases, yes, in most cases, we'll say, appraisals are in perhaps all cases as far as we're concerned. Appraisals, and these appraisals represent the target group as having these properties. And these representations are very different from high order evaluative judgments, right? Once again, appraisals are low level representations that are very automatic, very fast, very basic somehow, and often not consciously available, or at least not directly. And yes, they are also very hard to paraphrase and are very different from the evaluative judgments that we express through affirmative sentences. Right, so the way in which this picture is both expressive and descriptive is, I mean, this is an expressive picture. It is somehow descriptive, but in a very indirect way, right? But nevertheless, I think it's interesting to note that the two families of theories seem to somehow describe this picture, depending on how we understand it. All right. Now, may group sentiment expressivism be applicable to other terms? The first thing to note is that, for instance, Ken Bark considers that slurs include many different kinds of negative terms. So it's not only ethnic and racial slurs, as is usually discussed, but he also includes things like bastard or couch potato or charlatan, which some people would not consider a slur. It doesn't matter. He argues that they should all be analyzed through the same scheme. And it seems to me that if we are able to identify the target groups that are referred with these terms, to which we refer with these terms in some non-evaluative way, then we can apply the group sentiment analysis to these slurs understood in a broad term of slur. Probably the same should be true of laudatives, which are somehow the reverse phenomenon of slurs, as Bach understand them. That is, we may understand them as referring to target group of people and to express positive sentiments toward these the members of this group. Okay, now what would be more challenging and perhaps more interesting would be to see whether group sentiment expressivism could apply for other thick terms. And yes, once again, like this is very much work in progress, and I don't have strong opinions about this as of yet. So, but we can try. So for instance, lewd is a term or idiom that may be understood as follow, that purports to refer to sexually explicit behaviors or attitudes. That would be the neutral way of neutral phenomenon, so to say, that is targeted by lewd. The term is expressive of negative sentiment toward this phenomenon. So perhaps a disposition for blame, for instance, or being shocked, or I don't know. And is expressive perhaps in virtue of being a signal for the adherence to a group whose members have this positive sentiment. I'm not sure about this term because I'm not a native English speaker, but it may be linked to Judeo-Christian group of speaker. I don't know. And this term would be appropriate, inoffensive and harmless, insofar as the sentiment is appropriate, inoffensive and harmless, which may be debated, right? So it seems to fit at least the format. It doesn't appear completely senseless. I don't know if it works exactly, but yes, we could do the same for courageous or rude if we can identify the neutral equivalent of these thick terms. But note that the fact that slurs usually have a well-known lexicalized neutral equivalence makes an important difference concerning implicatures, concerning pragmatics, because if the person knows the other term, why hasn't she used this other term, you can make implicatures on this basis. That's not the case for courageous or lewd. There is no lexicalized, well-known equivalent on which you could base the same kind of implicatures. Just a note. Okay, so let me just recap briefly. Research on emotion gives expressivism more plausibility than is usually recognized. In particular, the view that emotions possess 5 components and are not mere non-cognitive feelings. The distinction between emotions and sentiments, and that between expressive cues and actual expression. It shows that affect expressivism doesn't exclude descriptivism, I think. And viewing slurs as expressive cues for group sentiments may also potentially help to analyze the meaning of other affectively loaded terms. Thank you for your attention.
Great, thanks so much. That was great.